You know when you live long enough to start to believe you've seen everything life can throw at you. I'm 94 years old now. My hands shake a little. My steps are slow. But my memory is still very clear. And there is one memory, one decision that never leaves my mind, why I spent my whole life working, not chasing luxury, not chasing fame, just working, day after day, year after year. I woke up before sunrise most mornings, went to work while the streets were still quiet, and came home long after the sun had gone down. Back then, life wasn't easy, Di, and nothing was handed to you. If you wanted something, you earned it. My friends used to spend their money on new cars, vacations, potsherd, fancy dinners. But I bought every single dollar I could. Sometimes I skipped things I wanted. Sometimes I told myself, maybe next year, maybe later. Was age one reason, Betan? Family, there was always one reason, family. You see, when you have a child, everything changes. Suddenly your dreams become smaller, and theirs become everything. I remember the day my son was born, tiny hands, to tiny face, bought crying louder than anything I'd ever heard, but I held him right there in that hospital room. And I promised something. I promised that boy he would never struggle the way I did, so I worked harder when he needed school supplies. I worked overtime when he wanted to go to college. I worked weekends when life threw problems at him. I tried to be the wall that stopped the storm. Years passed faster than I ever expected. Children grow up before you realize it. One day you're teaching them how to ride a bicycle. Next thing you know, they're taller than you. And then one day, they're standing in front of you, telling you they want to start their own life. That's how it should be. Parents raise their children so they can walk their own path. But even then, even when he became a grown man, I still worried about him. That's what parents do. They never stop. Over the decades I kept saving, like little by little. By a small account turned into something bigger. When bigger again, I didn't tell many people about it, not even friends. It wasn't money for me with me. It was security, for him. But if life ever knocked him down, I wanted him to have something to stand on. Years later, when I was already in my late 80s, the savings had grown to $250,000. $250,000. Even saying that number felt strange. For a man who started with nothing, it felt like a mountain of money. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one evening, table I'd eaten dinner at for 40 years. There was a cup of coffee in front of me, already cold, and I kept staring at the number written on that bank statement, $250,000. I thought about all the mornings I woke up before the sun, all the nights I came home tired, all the sacrifices. And then I thought about my son. At that time, he was going through a difficult period bills piling up, work problems, stress you could see on his face. A father notices those things, even when a son tries to hide them. He would sit across from me sometimes, pretending everything was fine. But I could see it. The worry in his eyes. So one day, I made a decision, maybe the biggest decision of my life. I called him and asked him to come over. It was a quiet afternoon. The house was silent, except for the ticking clock on the wall. He walked in, sat down across from me, and asked what was wrong. I told him nothing was wrong. In fact, I told him something good was about to happen. He looked confused, and I remember smiling kind, because fathers rarely get the chance to truly surprise their children. I pulled out the paperwork from the bank. My hands were shaking a little, not from age, but from emotion. I slid the papers across the table. He looked down with Kaya did something bad. He looked down with seeing, but he was seeing. Then he looked back up at me, and I told him something I'll never forget, saying door. I told him this money, every dollar of it, was saved for him. $250,000. All his I said I wanted him to use it to rebuild his life, clear his debts, breathe again. For a moment he didn't say anything, but then his eyes filled with tears. He stood up, walked around the table, and hugged me harder than he had since he was a child. And in that moment, I truly believed I had made the best decision of my life. I remember that hug very clearly. When you live long enough, moments like that become treasures in your memory. Moments like that become treasures in your memory, like he did when he was a little boy. When he used to run to me after falling off his bicycle, and I thought to myself, this is why a man works his whole life, not for money, not for recognition, but for moments like that. He kept thanking me over and over, saying I had saved him, but saying I had changed everything for him. I told him something simple. I said, that's what fathers do. They help their children stand up when life knocks them down. After that day, things seemed different. He looked lighter, less worried, and for the first time in a long time, I felt peaceful. At my age, doxed. Peace is something you start to value more than anything. Bass became quiet again. My teas became quiet again. I spent most of my time sitting in the living room, watching the sunlight move slowly across the floor. Sometimes I read old newspapers. Sometimes I just sat there thinking about the past. One of these become your closest companions when you reach 94. Weeks passed. My son didn't visit as often as before, but I understood that life is busy when you're younger. Jobs, responsibilities, families upon families. I never wanted to be the kind of father who complains about that. So I told myself everything was fine. Every now and then he would call with conversations were short. He would say things were improving. And hearing that made me happy. Well, very happy, because when you give something like that, you don't expect anything in return. You just hope it truly helps. One evening, I decided to call him myself. It had been a while since we spoke. The phone rang several times before he answered, distracted, like someone who was busy doing something else. I asked him how he was doing. He said things were good. I asked if he had managed to clear some of his debts. Why, it was a short silence on the line. Made him. Why, what religious? Then he said yes. Some of them, his answers felt brief, almost rushed. But again, I told myself he was just busy. So I didn't ask many questions. I didn't want to sound like I was checking on him, but after all, I had given him that money freely. It was his now. For father shouldn't interfere too much in a grown man's life. Months kept passing. My world stayed small. The same chair, the same window, the same ticking clock on the wall. Why, sometimes I would look at the empty space where the bank documents used to sit in my drawer, and I would smile with me because I believed that money was out there helping my son build a better future. That thought alone was enough for me. Then one afternoon something happened, something small, but strange. A neighbor came over to visit. He sat with me for a while. We talked about the weather, about old times, by old times. Then during the conversation he mentioned something casually. He said he had seen my son recently driving a brand new car, a very expensive one. At first I didn't think much of it. For him, maybe things had improved for him. Maybe he had finally reached a better place in life. And if that was true, I was happy, truly happy. But later that night I sat alone in my chair, thinking $250,000 is a lot of money. But clearing debts usually doesn't leave enough for luxury cars. I tried to push the thought away. A father shouldn't assume the worst about his own child. Still the thought stayed there, quiet, persistent. A few days later I decided to call him again, just to talk, just to hear his voice. When he answered, I asked how everything was going. He said, great, better than ever. Without thinking too much, I asked him about the car. There was a pause on the phone, a longer pause than before. Then he laughed, a nervous kind of laugh, and said something that made my chest feel heavy. He said, Dot, sometimes you have to enjoy life too. For a moment I didn't say anything. I just sat there, folding the phone, but looking at the wall in front of me. I wasn't angry, Dot. Not yet. But something inside me had started to crack, because the money I gave him was never meant for luxury. It was meant to save him, to give him stability, to protect him from the kind of struggles I had spent my whole life trying to shield him from. I slowly asked him another question. A simple one. I asked how much of the money was left. Another silence, longer this time. Then he said something that made the room feel colder than it had ever felt before. He said, most of it is gone. And in that moment, for the first time in 94 years, I felt something I had never expected to feel toward my own son. Not anger, not even sadness, but something much heavier, something that made the house feel emptier than it had ever been. But